In a quiet Virginia town, late one night, a seemingly innocent traffic stop takes a dark twist. Jasmine Blake, a composed professional returning home after a long day, is suddenly accused of a crime she didn't commit. When two officers pull her over, they try to frame her for possessing illegal substances. What seems like a simple mistake is, in fact, a carefully planned setup. Jasmine knows this is no accident, she's being targeted. What happens next will shock you and reveal how the truth is always bound to come out. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories like this. In the stillness of a quiet Virginia town, under the flickering glow of the streetlights and the hum of a deserted highway, a routine traffic stop was about to take a dark turn. The night seemed calm, with only the occasional sound of passing cars breaking the silence. Officer John Harper, a tall, broad-shouldered man, and his partner, Officer Daniel Scott, a shorter, stockier figure, were on their regular patrol shift. Both men had spent years working together, and their bond ran deep, one based on shared routines, mutual trust, and the unspoken understanding that the world was often gray, and they were the ones who defined its boundaries. But tonight, something was about to shatter that understanding. A sleek black SUV rolled down the empty street, its headlights cutting through the night. Behind the wheel sat a woman named Jasmine Blake, a well-put-together professional, her hands resting lightly on the wheel. She had a calm, steady demeanor, a quiet confidence in the way she held herself. It had been a long day for Jasmine, one that ended later than expected, and she was looking forward to going home to her small apartment in the quiet part of town. She had been in a leadership meeting for a non-profit organization and now, just after midnight, she was heading back to her place, thinking about her work and the presentation she had to give the next morning. There was little in her expression to betray any sense of worry. As Jasmine approached a quiet intersection, she slowed, instinctively checking her surroundings. She had been on this street countless times before, but tonight, her eyes caught a glint of something in the corner of her vision, an unmarked stop sign she'd never seen before. She came to a full stop, glancing at her watch and feeling the weight of the long day. At that moment, her intuition, one she had developed through years of being cautious, was sharp. She didn't know it yet, but it was that sharpness that would soon be tested in ways she never expected. As she turned left onto another road, the sudden flash of blue and red lights erupted behind her. The sound of a siren pierced the air, shattering the calm of the night. Jasmine's heart didn't race. Instead, she remained still, her expression neutral, her thoughts focused and calculated. She had dealt with traffic stops before, though rarely with a sense of the tension she was about to experience. She knew that if there was any issue, it would be something small, perhaps an oversight or a mistake. However, this time was different. The sirens blared louder, and the patrol car drew closer. Jasmine, trained to remain composed in tense situations, guided her car slowly to the side of the road, turning off the engine. Her mind quickly shifted into focus. Reaching for the glove compartment, she pulled out her license and registration, ready to follow the routine. As she did so, she glanced up through her rearview mirror. Officer Harper, the taller one, had already stepped out of the car, his hand resting casually on his belt as he walked toward her vehicle, his partner, Officer Scott, following closely behind. The first officer was the one who approached her window, his eyes scanning the inside of the car with a practiced gaze. His body language was rigid, and there was a slight tension in his movements, one that didn't belong in such a routine situation. There was an arrogance in his posture, something Jasmine could immediately sense as he bent down to shine a flashlight inside the vehicle. "Good evening, ma'am," Officer Harper said, his voice deep, laced with authority that didn't fit the moment. He leaned closer to Jasmine's window, his flashlight beam moving over her face and the interior of the SUV. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" Jasmine met his gaze with the calm, controlled poise she had mastered over the years. "No, officer," she replied evenly, her tone polite yet firm. "I made a full stop at the intersection and wasn't speeding." Harper's lips twitched into the smallest of smirks, almost condescending. He tilted his head, the light from the flashlight moving deliberately across her face. "Actually, you failed to stop at a stop sign back there. That's a moving violation." Jasmine's brow furrowed just slightly, the first sign of confusion breaking her otherwise calm expression. "I'm certain I stopped at the sign, officer." Without waiting for further clarification, Harper interrupted her with a hard edge in his voice. "License and registration," he snapped, his tone shifting. Jasmine handed over the documents with a slow, deliberate motion, her fingers steady. It was a minor inconvenience, something she had gone through many times before, but there was something off about this stop. She couldn't quite place it yet, but the air felt heavier. As Officer Harper examined her documents, his gaze lingered on her name. Jasmine could see the wheels turning in his mind. A subtle shift in his posture gave it away. His scrutiny was intense, deliberate. He was trying to make her feel small. He finally returned the documents with a grunt, his eyes lingering on her. "You live around here?" he asked, almost as though he were making sure she belonged. "Yes, officer," Jasmine replied calmly. "Local address. Virginia plates." The quiet night stretched on for a moment longer, but the unease in the air intensified. Harper exchanged a brief glance with Officer Scott, who had been standing by the rear of her SUV. Scott was pointing at something inside the vehicle, his face grim as he motioned for Harper to come over. Jasmine couldn't make out the words, but the exchange between them was unmistakable. Something wasn't right. Harper straightened, now holding her documents in his hand without comment. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Jasmine's expression didn't falter. Her voice was calm but questioning. "May I ask why, officer?" "We've got reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances," Harper replied flatly, his words heavy with implication. Jasmine's eyes narrowed. "Illegal substances," she repeated, barely holding back the shock in her voice. Harper's face remained unreadable. "We'll see about that. Step out." Without a word, Jasmine opened the door and stepped out of her vehicle. Her movements were fluid, deliberate. She knew what was coming, and she knew that the game was already shifting. As she stood by the car, her body language remained unbroken, her focus sharp. Something wasn't adding up. The officer's actions were deliberate, too deliberate for a simple traffic violation. Officer Scott was waiting by the back of her SUV, a smug expression on his face as he opened the trunk. "What do you know?" he said mockingly, gesturing to a small, unmarked bag sitting near the edge of the trunk. "A bag of powdery goodness," he added, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Jasmine's eyes flicked to the bag and back to the officers, her face unreadable. Her mind was working at full speed, calculating the implications. The bag hadn't been there when she'd left her house. She was sure of it. This was a setup. The officers had planned this. She didn't flinch. Instead, she took a deep breath and allowed the words to come. "I'll save my comments for the appropriate setting," she said, her voice steady. Harper's smirk grew wider. "Oh, you'll have your chance," he said, his tone hardening. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." As Officer Scott moved to cuff her, Jasmine allowed it without protest. Her gaze remained steady, unwavering. She knew this was just the beginning, and the truth was about to explode in ways they never saw coming. Jasmine Blake remained calm as the officers cuffed her, the cold metal biting into her wrists. The night's stillness had shattered, replaced with the frantic pulse of adrenaline running through her body. The officers had made their move, and she could feel the weight of their accusations settle around her like an oppressive fog. Though the situation was escalating fast, Jasmine didn't let herself panic. She had been trained for moments like this. As an experienced professional in high-stakes environments, she knew how to maintain control and read people's intentions. These officers, however, had underestimated her resolve. They had already made a grave mistake, one that they would soon regret. Officer Harper's voice was sharp, his words cutting through the tension. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute," he said, a smug satisfaction tinging his tone. Jasmine didn't respond. She simply allowed the cuffs to tighten around her wrists, her expression unchanged. Her confidence was unwavering. Her gaze shifted to Officer Scott, who was inspecting the trunk of her SUV with exaggerated suspicion. A grin curled at the edges of his lips, his actions deliberate as he pulled out a small, unmarked bag from near the back of the trunk. He held it up in the air, clearly pleased with what he had found. His voice was dripping with mock surprise as he spoke. "Well, well, look what we have here," Officer Scott said, his words coated in sarcasm. "A bag of powdery goodness. What do you think of that, ma'am?" Jasmine's sharp eyes flicked to the bag and then back to the officers. A flicker of recognition crossed her mind. She knew that bag hadn't been there when she had left her house. It had been planted. A tactic all too familiar in cases of police misconduct, one she had seen before in her line of work. Her body language remained unshaken. Her back straight, her posture controlled. Jasmine had faced far worse situations, ones with stakes far higher than this, but none had ever involved being framed by the very people sworn to protect her. She refused to let the officers see any sign of fear or guilt. They would not win this game, no matter how much they believed they had the upper hand. Jasmine spoke slowly, deliberately, her voice calm. "That bag wasn't in my car when I left my house. You're making a huge mistake." Officer Harper's smile tightened at the edges, his eyes narrowing. He stepped forward, his face now stern, his hand hovering near his weapon. "You can keep lying, but it won't change the facts," he said, his tone dismissive. Jasmine met his gaze steadily. She wasn't backing down. "I'm not lying, officer," she said firmly. "That's not my bag, and you know it." The officers exchanged glances, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They had orchestrated this entire situation with precision, and yet Jasmine's cool composure was throwing them off. The whole point of their plan was to intimidate her, make her nervous, so that she would crack. But Jasmine wasn't cracking. She wasn't backing down. "You don't have a choice, ma'am," Harper continued, his voice now low and condescending. "You'll go to jail, and you'll face the consequences. This is the reality for people like you." Jasmine's brows furrowed slightly at his words, but she didn't flinch. People like her? What exactly did he mean by that? She kept her mind focused, not allowing his words to distract her from what was happening. She had to be sharp. This wasn't just about her freedom. It was about exposing the corruption that had led to this moment. As Officer Scott moved to cuff her, Jasmine held still, but her mind was racing, cataloging every detail. She observed the subtle exchange of glances between the two officers, their over-the-top actions, and the deliberate way they were handling her. They were trying to rattle her, make her second-guess herself, but Jasmine wasn't the type to bend under pressure. She knew the system, and she knew how to fight back when it was needed. "Everything will be sorted out soon enough," Jasmine said with a quiet certainty. "You'll regret this." The officers ignored her words, focusing instead on their next steps. Harper pushed her toward the back of the squad car, the cold metal of the vehicle suddenly feeling all too real as she slid into the back seat. She could hear the officers laughing, speaking amongst themselves as they drove her toward the station. Their voices were full of bravado, as if they had already won. But Jasmine knew better. The game wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The ride to the station was a blur of flashing lights and the faint hum of the police radio. Jasmine kept her breathing steady, refusing to let the tightness in her chest get the best of her. She was playing a long game, one where patience was key. The officers were wrong to think that they had outsmarted her. They had no idea who they were dealing with. As they arrived at the station, Jasmine felt the weight of the situation settle in. The fluorescent lights overhead cast an unforgiving glow on the walls and the worn floors of the station. She was ushered inside, her hands still cuffed, as the officers proudly presented her to the night shift officers behind the counter. "She's caught red-handed," Officer Scott announced, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "We've got the evidence, drugs, right in her trunk. She's as guilty as they come." Jasmine didn't flinch. She had seen this game before. The station buzzed with the usual hum of activity, officers lounging behind their desks and chatting, but Jasmine knew the truth. The evidence they had was nothing more than a lie. The bag had been planted, and she was the pawn in their scheme. But it wouldn't stay that way for long. Jasmine was used to navigating the gray areas of life. This time, though, the stakes were much higher. She was led to the fingerprinting station, and though she kept her movements slow and deliberate, every second was an opportunity to gather more information. Her mind worked quickly, analyzing every movement of the officers around her. She had been here before, in situations where corruption ran deep. But she had a secret weapon: patience. As Officer Scott and Harper bantered about their victory, Jasmine's thoughts remained focused on her next move. She knew she wasn't alone in this fight. She had a team that would notice her absence soon enough and would come to her rescue. For now, she let the officers think they were in control. Jasmine knew they were only moments away from making a mistake they would never be able to take back. And when that moment came, everything they had done would come crumbling down. Officer James Keller sat at his desk, staring at the computer screen, his fingers resting uneasily over the keyboard. It had been a long night, but something about the arrest of Jasmine Blake wasn't sitting right with him. His training had taught him to follow orders, keep his head down, and trust the more experienced officers around him. But tonight, the nagging feeling that something was off refused to let him rest. The arrest just didn't add up. Keller had processed dozens of arrests in his short time on the force. Most had been routine: traffic violations, petty theft, occasional drug busts. But this arrest, felt different. He had witnessed how confidently Officer Harper and Officer Scott had handled Jasmine from the moment they dragged her out of her car. Their actions had been almost too smooth, too practiced. But what bothered Keller the most was the way Jasmine had responded to their accusations. Despite the severity of the situation, she hadn't panicked, hadn't shown fear or guilt. Instead, she had remained eerily calm, almost unnervingly so. It was as if she knew exactly what was happening, as if she was already 10 steps ahead of everyone else. Keller shook his head, trying to push aside the unease building in his gut. He was just a rookie, still learning the ropes. Officer Harper and Officer Scott were seasoned officers, respected by their colleagues. Surely, if they believed Jasmine was guilty, she had to be. But the more he thought about it, the less convinced he became. The arrest report that had been filed was simple enough. It outlined the traffic violation, Jasmine's failure to yield at an intersection. Then, of course, came the discovery of the bag of drugs in her trunk, which had conveniently appeared during the search. But something about the whole thing felt too neat, too perfect. It was almost as if the whole scenario had been rehearsed. His mind kept returning to the details. Jasmine's behavior. The way Officer Scott had discovered the bag of drugs. The way the officers had exchanged glances after she was cuffed. The officers had been too confident in their actions, as if they already knew how this would play out. Keller couldn't help but wonder, had they planted the evidence? Was this a setup? His stomach churned at the thought. He had heard whispers of corruption in the department, of officers manipulating situations for their benefit, but he had always brushed those rumors aside as hearsay. But now, sitting in the quiet of the station, the possibility seemed more and more plausible. Jasmine hadn't shown the typical signs of a guilty person. She hadn't fidgeted nervously, or tried to deny the charges. Instead, she had remained stoic, almost as if she was waiting for something. It was an unsettling thought, but it was one Keller couldn't ignore. He glanced over at the desk where Officers Harper and Scott were seated. They were laughing, drinking coffee, their casual demeanor a stark contrast to the gravity of the situation. They were acting as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened, as if framing an innocent woman for a crime she didn't commit was just part of the job. Keller's unease deepened as he watched them. He wanted to believe in them, to trust that they were doing their jobs correctly, but something was nagging at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line, and Jasmine was the victim of it. Keller's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Officer Scott standing by his desk, a smug grin on his face. "You still look like you've got something on your mind, Keller," Scott said, his voice low and taunting. "Don't tell me you're starting to second-guess this one. Everything's in order, kid. We got the evidence, we've got the report. She's guilty." Keller forced a smile, trying to mask the unease building in his chest. "I'm not second-guessing anything," he said, his voice steady. "Just, doing my job." Scott's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, leaning in closer. "Listen, rookie," he said in a low voice. "Don't get too caught up in the details. You'll learn soon enough that this is how it works. We've been doing this for years. We know what we're doing. You're just here to follow orders, not question them." Keller nodded, but inside, a small spark of defiance began to grow. He knew his place on the force, but something about the way Scott spoke to him, so dismissively, only made him more determined to get to the bottom of the situation. This wasn't just about doing his job, it was about doing what was right. As the hours passed, Keller couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He couldn't stop thinking about the report, the evidence, and Jasmine's calm demeanor. What if she was innocent? What if the officers were framing her? He knew it was a dangerous thought, one that could get him in trouble if he acted on it. But he also knew that he couldn't just ignore his instincts. If he did, he would be complicit in whatever corruption was taking place in the station. Keller stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He walked over to the records room, his mind racing. As he pulled up Jasmine's file on the computer, he felt a bead of sweat form on his forehead. He quickly scanned the details: the arrest report, the search, the drugs in the trunk. But then, something caught his eye. There was a gap in the report. The timestamp for when the drugs were discovered didn't match the timeline of events. The search had taken place after Jasmine was already detained. It didn't make sense. The officers had to have planted the evidence. Keller's heart raced as he began to dig deeper into the department's records. What he found made his stomach turn. There were similar cases, all involving Officer Harper and Officer Scott. Minor traffic violations escalating into drug charges, with the same pattern of evidence being found during the search. Most of the suspects were people of color, and all of them had been convicted. It was a pattern, a dangerous one. Keller's hand trembled as he scrolled through the files. He had seen enough. He couldn't just sit back and pretend everything was fine anymore. The truth was staring him in the face, and it wasn't something he could ignore. He knew what he had to do. It was time to take action, to make sure the truth came to light. He couldn't stand by and let this corruption continue. He had to be the one to expose it, even if it meant going against his own colleagues. Keller's resolve solidified as he left the records room and made his way to his desk. He had a decision to make. Would he stay silent, like so many others had done before him? Or would he risk everything to do what was right? The answer was clear. As he sat back down, he pulled up his email and began typing a message, his fingers moving quickly over the keys. He couldn't keep quiet anymore. He had to speak up. Talia Blake sat motionless on the cold metal bench of her holding cell, her back straight, her eyes calm and focused. The dim, flickering lights above her created long shadows on the concrete floor, but she didn't flinch. The hours stretched on, but her mind was sharp, calculating every second. She had been through situations like this before, though never quite this intense. The stakes had never been so high, and the officers' attempts to frame her were no accident. This was more than just a mistake, it was a planned operation. Her eyes briefly flicked to the edges of the cell, where an old, rusted camera was mounted. It was a surveillance camera, the type that most small stations used, outdated, with poor resolution and little maintenance. The perfect tool for a quiet trap. Talia had already studied its position during her short time in the station. It wasn't much, but it was enough for what she needed to do. She let out a silent breath and subtly shifted her hand beneath her jacket, brushing against a small device hidden in the hem. It was no bigger than a coin, but it was a key tool for her to signal her team. With a barely perceptible click, the tracker activated. She didn't need to say a word, didn't need to explain anything. She trusted her team implicitly, and they would know exactly what to do next. Talia didn't allow herself to show any outward signs of anticipation, but her mind was already working in overdrive. The tracker was sending out a signal that would lead her team straight to the heart of the corruption within this police station. She had one job now: to stay calm and composed while the truth began to unravel. Outside her cell, the station continued its business as usual. Officers shuffled about, passing the time with idle chatter. but something in the air had shifted. The usual comfort the officers found in their routine had been replaced by an almost imperceptible tension. Officer Keller, the rookie who had been quietly questioning the validity of the arrest, had noticed it, too. Keller had spent the last few hours replaying every moment of Jasmine's arrest in his mind. His doubts were growing, but he wasn't sure where to turn or who to trust. He had already begun to question Officer Harper and Officer Scott's actions, but the more he dug into the case, the more his instincts told him he had stumbled upon something far bigger than a simple case of misconduct. There were inconsistencies, gaps in the arrest report, and the planted drugs in Jasmine's trunk. It was all too staged. He had tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in his stomach, but it was becoming impossible. The evidence didn't match up, and there was no legitimate reason for Jasmine to be in custody. He had already begun to do some digging of his own, but he hadn't acted on it yet. He was too scared of the consequences. Officers like Harper and Scott had a lot of sway in the department, and Keller knew that challenging them could mean the end of his career before it even had a chance to begin. But now, with the presence of the FBI looming in the background, Keller felt an undeniable shift in the atmosphere of the station. He could see it in the way his colleagues acted, the way they avoided his gaze. Something was coming, and it wasn't just about Jasmine anymore. As the door to the holding area opened, Keller's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what he was expecting, but when he saw the tall, imposing figures of the FBI agents entering the station, he felt an unexpected rush of relief. He wasn't alone anymore. Someone else knew what was really going on here. The lead agent, Daniel Price, walked into the front desk area with quiet authority. His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the various officers lounging behind their desks. The casual demeanor that had ruled the station all night suddenly felt out of place. Keller watched as Price approached the desk sergeant, his expression unreadable but intense. "What's this about?" the sergeant asked, clearly taken aback by the sudden arrival of the federal agents. "Federal investigation," Agent Price replied firmly. "We need access to your records and holding cells immediately." Keller's stomach tightened as he watched the sergeant's face contort with suspicion. The tension was palpable. The sergeant hesitated, but there was no protocol for denying the FBI. With a begrudging nod, he gestured for the agents to follow him. Keller could feel the change in the air as the officers around him shifted in discomfort. Everyone knew what this meant. Price and the other agents didn't waste any time. They moved with purpose through the station, heading straight for the holding area where Jasmine Blake was being kept. Keller's eyes followed their movements, his heart pounding. For the first time in hours, he felt something shift within him, an inkling of hope that the truth might finally come to light. Back in the holding area, Talia remained perfectly still as the agents made their way to her cell. She hadn't needed to see them to know they were here. Her tracker had done its job. Her team had arrived, and the next part of the plan was in motion. Talia stood as the door to her cell opened. The lead FBI agent entered first, his demeanor calm but authoritative. "Miss Blake, you're free to go," he said. His voice was steady, offering her a sense of respect she hadn't received from the local officers. Talia nodded, her face remaining impassive. She knew the agents had the information they needed. She had no intention of celebrating just yet. The real work was just beginning. As she walked toward the door, she passed Officer Keller's desk. His gaze met hers, and she saw the uncertainty in his eyes. He hadn't acted yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time before he would make the decision to expose the truth. She gave him a slight nod, acknowledging the quiet support he had offered by questioning the arrest. It wasn't much, but for Keller, it was the first step toward redemption. As Talia walked through the station, the agents moved with purpose, their presence forcing every officer in the building to take notice. Price entered the interrogation room with his team, and the investigation began in earnest. The officers who had been involved in the corruption, Officer Harper and Officer Scott, were cornered. Inside the interrogation room, Price wasted no time in confronting them. He laid out the evidence, the surveillance footage, the audio recordings from Talia's hidden tracker, and the records of previous arrests that followed a disturbingly similar pattern. Officer Scott tried to deny everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. "You can't do this," Scott stammered. "We were just doing our job." Price leaned forward, his voice unwavering. "No, you were bending the law to serve your own interests. And now, you'll answer for it." The storm had arrived. Outside, the officers who had once walked with swagger and confidence now looked like cornered animals. Keller could see the cracks forming in the facade they had built. The weight of their actions was finally sinking in, and the FBI's presence was a stark reminder that they could no longer hide behind their badges. Talia stood outside, knowing that the truth had finally started to break free. The officers who had framed her were now facing the consequences of their corruption. But this was just the beginning. She had exposed a systemic problem within the police force, and she would make sure the truth remained exposed for as long as it took to make real change. As the FBI agents moved forward with their investigation, Keller stood quietly in the background, knowing that he had made the right choice. He had questioned the system, and he had helped bring it down. The storm was over, but the ripples of change would be felt for a long time. The bright fluorescent lights of the interrogation room cast harsh shadows on the faces of Officer Brandon Carter and Officer Mark Sullivan. They sat across from Agent Daniel Price, whose steady gaze never wavered as he prepared to expose their corruption. Their posture had changed from earlier swagger to stiff tension, both officers now fully aware that their lies were about to be unraveled. The man who had once been so confident in his authority, Carter, now looked like a man who had been cornered. Price was calm but direct. He placed a folder onto the metal table between them. It was thick, filled with photos, reports, and other incriminating evidence. Carter and Sullivan both stiffened as Price opened it, revealing surveillance footage from the station, timestamps of their actions, and photographs taken from the scene of the staged arrest of Talia Blake. "So, gentlemen," Price began, his voice quiet but firm. "Would you like to explain these?" The first photo was of Carter and Sullivan standing next to the trunk of Talia's SUV, laughing as they held the small, unmarked bag of drugs that had conveniently appeared out of nowhere. There was no mistaking it. The image was clear, and the smirk on Sullivan's face as he handled the bag was almost too obvious to ignore. Sullivan swallowed hard, his usual bravado gone, replaced with palpable fear. He shifted uneasily in his chair, glancing at Carter, who was still trying to maintain his composure. But the evidence was mounting, and neither man had the courage to speak. Price slid the next photograph across the table. It was another image from the station's security cameras, this time showing both officers looking conspicuously at the bag of drugs before it was planted in Talia's vehicle. The timestamp was precise, and there was no denying their involvement. "What do you have to say about this?" Price asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Carter shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. "We were just doing our jobs. We thought we had probable cause." "Probable cause?" Price repeated, raising an eyebrow. You thought you had probable cause to search her vehicle, and yet, despite being a law enforcement officer for years, you missed the glaring fact that the bag wasn't there when she first left her home. Sullivan, trying to salvage what little pride he had left, leaned forward. We didn't plant anything. We found the evidence in her trunk. Price leaned back, allowing the weight of the question to settle in the room. Do you honestly think we're going to believe that? He opened the next page of the folder, revealing more damning evidence. This time it was an audio recording, one that had been secretly made with the tracker on Talia's person. The recording was crystal clear, capturing a conversation between the two officers as they discussed how easy it would be to plant drugs on Talia and make her the perfect scapegoat. Sullivan's voice was unmistakable, chuckling as he talked about how nobody would bat an eye if they framed Talia for the crime. Carter's face blanched, his eyes narrowing as the truth hit him harder than any punishment could. He glanced at Sullivan, whose face was drained of color, his hands gripping the edge of the table like a lifeline. You can't use that," Sullivan stammered. "That's entrapment." Agent Price's expression hardened. "No, Sullivan. What you've done is called a crime. It's called corruption. It's called framing an innocent woman and abusing the very authority you were entrusted with." Carter, who had been trying to remain stoic, finally broke. He let out a shaky breath, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. "We didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We needed to make an arrest. We thought we'd caught her in something, anything." Price didn't flinch. "Your desperation doesn't justify your actions. Do you think you're the first officers to try and cover up their tracks? Do you think this will just go away because you're sitting behind a badge?" The interrogation room was suffocatingly quiet for a moment. The two officers were broken, their lies exposed, and now there was no escape. The mountain of evidence, the recordings, the surveillance footage, it all painted a clear picture. "You're done," Price said firmly. "You're both under arrest for the unlawful detention, framing of an innocent woman, and several other charges. Your careers are over." As the words settled into the room, Sullivan let out a low, pained laugh. "You don't understand. We thought we were doing the right thing. She was a threat, someone who had to be stopped." Carter shook his head slowly, his voice empty of the confidence it once held. "No, Sullivan. We weren't stopping anything. We were just trying to cover our own asses. We made a mistake. And now we're going to pay for it." Price signaled to the other agents, who stepped forward to arrest Carter and Sullivan. As they were led out of the interrogation room in handcuffs, they passed by the front desk where Officer Keller stood. His eyes followed the two men as they were escorted away. The entire station was watching. In the hallway, the two corrupt officers were led past their colleagues, some of whom were still processing the events. The once indomitable figures of Carter and Sullivan now appeared as defeated, broken men. Their lies, their manipulation, and their abuse of power had been exposed in front of the entire station. Their names, once known for upholding the law, would now be synonymous with disgrace. Keller stood at the side, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never imagined that he would be part of something so monumental. For the first time in his career, he felt the weight of doing the right thing. He had questioned the arrest, and he had helped expose the truth. The tension that had built up in the station now seemed to lift, replaced with a sense of justice that finally had a chance to prevail. Talia Blake was no longer behind bars. The truth had been uncovered, and the officers who had wronged her were facing the consequences. For Keller, the road ahead was uncertain, but at least now, he could look at himself in the mirror and know he had done what was right. As the FBI agents continued their work, the station began to change. Officers began to ask questions, reevaluate their actions, and wonder who else had been part of the corrupt system. The ripple effect had begun, and the future was uncertain. But one thing was clear: justice had been served, and the truth would never be silenced again. The cold, sterile walls of the Arlington Police Department felt lighter as Talia Blake stepped out of the holding cell. The quiet murmur of voices in the station seemed almost distant, a stark contrast to the oppressive tension that had filled the air only hours before. She had remained calm throughout the entire ordeal, knowing that her team was in the background, carefully orchestrating the revelation of the truth. And now, after everything had been exposed, she was finally free. Talia's release was swift. Her lawyer, along with the federal agents, had worked tirelessly to ensure that the charges against her were formally dropped. The corrupt officers who had once believed they were untouchable were now in handcuffs, facing the harsh consequences of their actions. The weight that had pressed down on her chest since the night of her arrest had finally been lifted. As Talia walked toward the front desk, she passed the row of officers still trying to process what had just transpired. The station had become a chaotic mix of disbelief and silence. Her eyes briefly met those of Officer Keller, who stood in the corner, watching the events unfold. Their silent exchange was all it took to convey everything that had happened. He had played a key role in her release, and she knew that it was only because of his courage to question the corruption that this entire process had been set in motion. "Miss Blake, you're free to go," an agent said as he unlocked the cell doors, his voice filled with a quiet respect. He handed her a folded piece of paper, a release form that signified the end of her detention. "I'll escort you out." As Talia stepped into the hallway, the oppressive weight of the station seemed to dissipate with each step. The officers who had once held power over her now seemed irrelevant. The world outside awaited her, and she was eager to move forward. But first, there were matters left to address. Keller was waiting near the entrance, his expression uncertain, his posture a little rigid, as if unsure how to approach her. As Talia walked past, he hesitated for a moment, then opened his mouth. I didn't think you'd be walking out of here so soon," he said quietly, his voice tinged with the exhaustion of the past few hours. "Are you okay?" Talia stopped, meeting his gaze with a steady look. "I'm fine now," she said, her voice calm but tinged with the quiet strength she had carried throughout the ordeal. "Thank you, Keller. If it weren't for you, I'd still be sitting in that cell." Keller's cheeks flushed slightly at the gratitude in her voice, but there was a slight hint of relief in his eyes. He had never imagined that a single decision, a single act of courage, would lead to such a monumental change. He had stood up against what he knew was wrong, and it had made a difference. "I just did what I thought was right," Keller said, his voice quiet but firm. "I couldn't just stand by and let it happen." Talia gave him a small, appreciative smile before turning toward the exit. "And you did it. Now, I think we can both agree that some changes need to happen around here." As Talia stepped out into the fresh air, she could feel the cool breeze wash over her. It felt like a new beginning, but she knew the fight wasn't over. The truth had been revealed, but there were still reforms to be made, still people to hold accountable. Still a broken system to rebuild. Back inside the station, things were beginning to fall apart for Officers Carter and Sullivan. The evidence against them was irrefutable. The planted drugs, the falsified reports, the conversations captured on tape, it all painted a damning picture. Their arrest had been a long time coming, but the magnitude of the charges they now faced was undeniable. Carter and Sullivan sat in the interrogation room, their heads hung low as they realized the full extent of their situation. The smirks and bravado they had once worn with such confidence were now replaced with the weight of impending ruin. Their careers were over. Their reputations shattered. The corruption they had thought they could get away with had finally caught up to them. In the days that followed, the department was thrown into turmoil. Officers who had once looked the other way began to question their own involvement. Some even resigned, unable to stand by the system they had once been a part of. Others, like Keller, who had dared to speak out, became symbols of change, though not without facing their own challenges. But for Keller, the recognition for his bravery came swiftly. His decision to stand up against corruption didn't go unnoticed, and his actions were eventually praised by both his colleagues and the public. While some still resented him for exposing the truth, many more were grateful that the system was being held accountable. Keller was recognized for his courage and commitment to justice, but he was careful not to let the attention go to his head. He knew that the work was far from over. The department, under increasing pressure from the media and the public, began a series of reforms. New leadership was put in place, and a task force was established to investigate other potential cases of corruption within the force. The chief of police, who had been unaware of the depth of the issues, addressed the department with a public statement of apology and a vow to root out the corruption that had plagued their ranks for far too long. Keller, though still new to the force, was tapped to assist in these reforms. His unique position, having witnessed the rot from within, made him an invaluable resource. He worked alongside the new leadership to implement measures that would ensure transparency, accountability, and better oversight. While the road to rebuilding trust was long and uncertain, it was a start. Talia watched these changes from the sidelines, knowing that her role in bringing the truth to light had sparked a chain reaction. She had no desire for the fame or recognition that Keller had received, she simply wanted to see justice prevail. Her mission had been to expose corruption and protect the innocent, and that's exactly what she had done. As Talia sat on a park bench days later, reflecting on everything that had transpired, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The storm had passed, but the work was far from finished. Justice had been served for now, but she knew there would be more battles ahead. And as she watched the sun begin to set, Talia smiled faintly. For once, she could take a breath. But tomorrow, there would be another fight to fight. Talia Blake sat in the quiet corner of a modest cafe, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the table as she reflected on the events that had unfolded over the past few weeks. The ordeal with officers Brandon Carter and Mark Sullivan had come to an end, their corrupt practices exposed for all to see. Justice had been served, the weight of their wrongdoings lifted, and the Arlington Police Department had begun the arduous process of reform. But for Talia, it was time to move forward. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking her reverie. It was a message from Agent Daniel Price, the lead FBI agent who had overseen the investigation. She smiled faintly as she read the text, knowing what it meant. It was time for her next assignment. Talia had never been one to linger on past victories. Her work, by nature, was always forward-looking, always focused on the next challenge. The truth had been revealed in Arlington, but there were countless other systems to uncover, more people to protect, and more injustices to dismantle. The fight for justice didn't end with one victory, it was a continuous battle, and she was always ready for the next mission. As she read through the message, her thoughts drifted back to the moment when she had walked out of that holding cell, free at last, with the truth on her side. The shockwaves caused by Carter and Sullivan's arrests had rippled throughout the department, shaking its very foundation. But even as the truth had begun to surface, Talia knew that there would always be more like them, officers who thought they could exploit their position for personal gain, who thought they were untouchable, above the law. And it was her job to ensure they were brought down. But today, she allowed herself a moment of pause. The weight of the case had been heavy, and the battle for truth had demanded everything from her. She looked out the window, watching the world move on around her. People were going about their day, oblivious to the turmoil that had just unfolded in their community. But Talia knew that what she had done had changed the course of things, had started a ripple that would continue to spread far beyond the walls of that police station. She stood up, glancing one last time at her phone. The message from Agent Price was clear. Her next mission was already in motion. There would be no rest for Talia Blake. She grabbed her coat, slid it on with practiced ease, and walked out of the cafe. As she made her way to the car, her thoughts began to shift. She had learned much from her time in Arlington, the subtleties of corruption, the ways in which it festered in places where it was least expected. But more importantly, she had learned something about herself. She had faced the weight of an unjust system head-on and come out stronger. Now, she would take that experience with her, apply it to her next mission, and continue to unravel the lies that hid in plain sight. Talia's team was already mobilizing, ready to support her in whatever the next mission entailed. She had always relied on her team's expertise, their ability to act with precision, to provide the backup she needed when the stakes were high. In the world of covert operations, success depended not only on the individual but on the strength of the team behind them. She had seen firsthand what corruption could do when it was allowed to fester unchecked. But she also knew that the truth had a way of coming to light eventually, even in the darkest corners. She climbed into the car and drove toward the meeting point, her mind already shifting gears. The next mission was something far bigger than the situation in Arlington, something that could have far-reaching implications. She wasn't sure exactly what it entailed, but she knew it would require the same dedication, the same patience, and the same unyielding commitment to the truth that had guided her through the last mission. As the engine hummed beneath her, she couldn't help but reflect on the events of the past few weeks. The officers' lies had been exposed, and their web of corruption had been unraveled. But even as she allowed herself a small sense of satisfaction, she knew the system was far from fixed. There were still those who thought they could hide behind their badges, still those who believed they were above the law. And it was people like Talia who would keep exposing them, who would ensure that the truth always came out in the end. She arrived at the meeting point and stepped out of the car. Agent Price was waiting for her, his expression as unreadable as ever. He handed her a dossier, one that contained all the information she would need for her next mission. She glanced at it briefly before tucking it into her bag. There was no need to dive into the details just yet. She knew her role: expose the corruption, bring justice, and protect the innocent. "Everything in place?" Talia asked, her tone as sharp as ever. "Everything's ready," Agent Price replied. "Your next target is a high-profile case. But it's going to take more than just undercover work this time. You'll need all your skills, all your resources, to make this one stick." Talia nodded, her mind already processing the information. She had faced bigger challenges before, and this one would be no different. She would need to rely on every piece of training, every ounce of intuition, to bring the truth to light. But that was what she was built for. "Let's get to work," she said, her voice unwavering. As she walked toward the van where her team waited, Talia's thoughts turned back to Arlington. She had done what she set out to do, exposed the corruption, brought justice to those who had been wronged. But it was only the beginning. There would always be more to uncover, more lies to expose, more systems to break. Talia Blake wasn't done yet. She had just begun her mission, and there was still a long road ahead. But she knew one thing for certain: no matter how deep the corruption went, the truth would always find a way to rise to the surface. And Talia would be there to make sure it did. In life, we often find ourselves facing moments where the truth is hidden behind layers of deceit and corruption. Jasmine Blake's story is a powerful reminder that no matter how deeply lies are buried, they always find a way to surface. When confronted with injustice, it's easy to feel helpless, but standing firm in the face of adversity, like Jasmine did, can reveal the true power of patience, integrity, and courage. Sometimes, doing the right thing means challenging those in positions of power and exposing the wrongdoers who think they can get away with their actions. Justice doesn't always come easily, but it always has a way of breaking free when the right people fight for it. So, no matter where you are in life, remember that you can make a difference, just like Jasmine did. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support more powerful stories like this. Hit the bell to stay updated.